activist organizers and people who probably never thought that they would be, carrying a sign with that slogan. But the way that I think about this and the way that it's been sort of explained to me in part from a lot of the folks doing the work on the ground is that for many people, actually abolish the police is the idea. It is the end goal, and defund becomes the strategy for how you do that. And so what does abolishing the police really mean? In general, a lot of folks who use an abolish framework are connecting its history. They can draw a direct line between, slavery and the formation of this country and policing, right? So it's the same framework that we talk about in prisons, abolish prisons, right? To say these systems are inherently racist. That is where they began, that's the origin, and there's no disconnection. Just because we fast forward in time doesn't mean that the agenda, the goal, the outcomes, the culture have reckoned with that racist past. And so we don't see them as legitimate form of public safety, right? And I think the argument there is in terms of, are police actually keeping people safe, is a really interesting one. So if you just set aside, even if say you don't agree, you say that history doesn't make sense to me, let's just look at their record, right? So we've got 1,000 people, disproportionately Black, killed by police each year. We've got the Washington Post did a great series about the record low number of murder cases that police in Black and brown communities actually close, right? So they're not bringing these folks to justice. We've got a backlog of rape cases, rape kits across the country that have not been tested, right? You've got the disproportionate, stops and frisks that don't amount to much, right? And so if we really just look at the function of policing, there's an incredible argument to be made to say this method, this way of doing it actually doesn't promote public safety. And so a big portion of the argument is that across the country, in many cities, policing is one of the biggest line items on the city budget, right? We spend millions of dollars a year, billions of dollars a year. So I'm from New York, that's where I live, and the NYPD has a $6 billion budget every year. And so you think, well, that's a lot of money. What does it actually get us? How safe are we really? I think is the question that people are asking. And so the strategy to defund is arguing that police don't keep people safe. We've got the receipts on that, right? We can point to all of these instances to say, this is not working, especially in Black communities where people, slightest interaction for the slightest, incident wind up dead. I think Rayshard Brooks you could not find a more tragic example of this, right? Someone caught simply sleeping in his car, intoxicated and results in death. There's no coming back from that. And so they're saying, what if we took a pool of that money, all of it, some of it, right? I think the details are slowly being worked out, and invest it in these communities that have been systematically under and disinvested in. So if we take this money, in the case of the NYPD, $6 billion, and we say, well, what could we do? How could we invest in housing, in job training, in healthcare, in mental health care? How can we think about getting at some of the underlying causes that lead to crime, that lead to violence, right? I think a lot of people make the argument around crimes like theft, shoplifting, things like this, where people are often caught, stealing things that are clearly about having their basic needs met, right? But they wind up being punished, criminalized, sent to jail or prison, only to come back out in no better economic standing or position than they were when they went in. And so I think, this movement is really requiring people to use their imagination and think about how you could actually create public safety without the need to criminalize people. Many of the activists I spoke to from Minnesota are basically saying that we have this, knee-jerk, very reflexive reaction to call the police for every little thing that maybe we don't need the police to intervene on. And so, George Floyd, I think, is another example of this. He was, allegedly using a counterfeit bill, and now he's dead, right? And did we truly need the police to intervene in a situation like this? Could the store owners have found any other way to address the fact that he was allegedly using this counterfeit money, right? Could you just sort of ban him from that store? Could you say, hey, don't do that again? Could you take the bill away, right? Could we think more creatively, holistically, with the value for human lives actually in mind, without relying on the police over and over and over again? I think the sort of last thing I'll say about that is when we also think about the function of the police, what do they actually do? They're not, for the most part, in the business of preventing crime. I think that that's a really important thing to point out. It may seem obvious, but actually I think for many people it is not. Police often intervene, or they're responding after the fact. You could argue, I think people do try to make this argument that, well, if they're taking folks off the street and locking them up, then in some ways they're preventing crime. But the research shows that that's not really how it works. That's not the case. Crime across the country is at historic lows. It is lower than it has ever been in our country, since we've been monitoring this. And so it's really important to point out that criminologists actually can't put their finger on any one thing about why crime is so low. Certainly there are economic components at play. One theory, says, well, we all have the internet now, and so people are entertained in a different way, right? It's a very complex, series of factors. And so just the notion that policing and prevention of crime are the same thing, and that's just, it's really important for me to point out that that's not the case, and that these calls for, abolish, defund, are about getting at those root issues that drive up crime, making sure that people's basic needs are met, that we're spending money in communities, that we're coming up with alternatives. They're asking, for a deeper and bigger investment in public safety, in things that they think could actually promote and bring about, a peaceful community where violence is not a part of it.
So with the follow-up question with that, Nicole, and Helena, I'm going to come to you next to also talk a little bit about what that possibility would look like in Minneapolis. But Nicole, there was a question put on our chat where someone says, well, I live in Chicago, and we had 101 people shot this weekend, and I believe 14 people died, and 5 of them were minors. So for our vice president of ASALH, he's saying, abolishing the police doesn't make sense when we're up against the wall in terms of historic shootings. So can you speak to that a bit? Because maybe it ties back into this point of seeing the police as the answer when really something else is needed.
Absolutely. I think it's a great and, extremely important question. I'd say that for every public, interview that I've given on defund, I would say the question always comes up about what do we do about murder? What do we do about gun violence? And what do we do about rape? And I think these are really important questions because these are the things that really create fear, right? That's what we are concerned when these big violent crimes come up. What is our response going to be? And Chicago, I think, is a really unique example where for decades, people have been working to do violence interruption work, to do peer interventions, to get other young men on the ground to talk to their peers and say, is this the best way to settle this argument, to settle this beef, right? To settle this long-standing feud? Do guns really need to come into play? But when you think about how these programs, at the scale at which they're funded versus the scale at which the police are funded, there's a huge disparity there. So, people say, oh, does this violent intervention work actually work? And I think the question is, well, have you really invested in it in any kind of systematic way and for a long enough time to be able to decide that, right? Another thing I'd say to the question of gun violence is that what all this research sort of is starting to point to, right? We've talked about gun violence as an epidemic, that it highlights the fact that there's something both social and contagious about gun violence. And so there's a ton of new scholarship that's starting to talk about how can you get to the person who is most at risk of committing gun violence before that happens. And one of the things they have seen, or what they know very clearly, is that it's often victims of gun violence who then go on to retaliate, right? And so I think framing it with this notion that what we're really looking at in many cases is unaddressed trauma, is PTSD, is mental health issues, is fear, that there's a complexity of things that are going in to create these kinds of issues, right? And that for many people who go into prison because they've committed a gun crime, because they've committed manslaughter or murder, that time that they spend outside of society, by and large, doesn't actually help them when they come back to society, right? Now, there are certainly people who find their way and figure it out and come out with, a bachelor's degree. I mean, there's tons of people who really do make the effort to turn their life around. At the Marshall Project, there are several folks on our staff, some of the most remarkable people that I've ever met, formerly incarcerated, right? They've taken the time, they found that space. They are the outlier. Prison is, by and large, not incredibly rehabilitative for many people. And so I think, we're looking at a problem that has social, mental, emotional issues at the core of it. We're solving that problem with policing, and we're not actually helping people break these cycles, right? We're not actually helping people get the help or the care that they need in order to make a different choice. And so I think it may feel like, it's not satisfying. The gun violence is happening right now. But I think I would just push just to question a little bit deeper of are the solutions that we currently have in place, are they working? Have they actually led to a different outcome? Are people getting their needs met here?
Helene, I want to pull you back into the conversation, and then Dr. Milewski, I'll come over to you. In Minneapolis, the New York Times just put out a piece on June 3rd that talked about how in Minneapolis, police officers are 7 times more likely to use force when they show up on the scene and the person is Black. Now, for a number of us, this, of course, is not a surprise. It's just kind of the data backing up what we've been saying in our community. When we talk about defunding or abolishing the police, can you just imagine for us, what would that actually look like in Minneapolis when you have someone like an Officer Siobhan with 18 charges against him still being able to show up on the scene and kind of mete out that type of judge, jury, executioner all at one time?
Right. I think when we hear the words abolish or defund the police, it sounds scary for so many people. And I want to push us to think that abolitionist communities already exist. And Miriam Kaba, well-known organizer from Chicago, says this. It's communities like Naperville, Illinois, right? Where there's communities where they're invested into, they have employment, they have jobs, they have housing, they have all of these resources they need to not only thrive, but succeed. And so these communities exist and they don't rely on the police for every little thing that happens. So really the question is not, can we get to that? It's why don't Black, brown, and indigenous communities also deserve that as well, right? Why do we not deserve the same investment? And so abolition is not just getting rid of police, it's the absence of communal care. It's the presence of communal care. It's the presence of resources that can help communities thrive. And I think it's really critical that when we think of the police, and always the question is the rapists, the murderers, but what we do now is not really helpful in addressing those issues, right? We live in a society in which we really embody punitive justice. You do something wrong, I will punish you. And I punish you by hurting you in return, or shaming you, or isolating you from your community, right? But if we want to get to the root causes of problems, we really need to think about transformative justice. And that's what a transformative justice framework brings in. Organizers on the ground are using transformative justice, ways of addressing harm and transforming harm that does not rely on the carceral state or bring in police. It's the notion that our communities are well equipped and we have the skills and resources we need to handle harm that occurs. And, organizations like Critical Resistance and Incite Women Against Violence have been doing this work with really challenging issues such as violence against women, sexual assault. They're doing this work with childhood sexual Gen 5 is doing that work. And so people are already building out this framework. And so abolition is not something that's new. It's something that people have been theorizing about and putting in the praxis. And so we take the lead from these organizations that have been doing the work. And I think what COVID-19 has shown us is that in times of crisis, state power increases and it's weaponized, and we tend to strengthen the carceral state when really what we want to do is decrease the carceral state and invest in our communities. I think 8 Can't Wait is a great strategy for that. It's ways that we can shrink the carceral state and really focus on giving communities the resources they need to thrive.
And so before we move on from this topic, Dr. Milewski, I want to come to you, because what we have seen, and maybe Nicole, you want to jump in here too when he finishes, what we have seen is that over the years, as funding has decreased in everything from housing for people who are temporarily experiencing homelessness, for schools, for what's happening in our communities, to parks and recs, police budgets have either stayed the same or they have ballooned, like in New York. I'm in Baltimore. And while the world is cutting budgets, our mayor just put forth another $500 million just for the Baltimore City Police Department, which means they would have put in $2 billion since 2017. And as Nicole noted, crime is not being impacted at all. We're not sure exactly where the money is going. So could you kind of help us historically frame what we're seeing and what is happening here so that we can then kind of understand how we can unpack it a little bit more?
Yeah. I think so. I think some excellent points are being made, and I think that's the whole point. We have put in a lot of money. We've kind of have a failed experiment on our hands, right? If we continue to keep throwing money at the police and funding, and building up that part of the city budgets in various cities, towns, counties, etc., then we're basically also saying that, the crime bills of the past, 1990s crime bill, the kind of, stop and frisk approach, the broken windows approach, as it was called here in New York for a long time, is the right one. And we know that it hasn't worked. It's failed miserably. It's been ruled unconstitutional in certain aspects of it. It's at least stop and frisk. But we also know that, and this is probably the part that's been forgotten about, is that we're the bosses, the citizens of these various cities. We pay the taxes, and that has all gotten completely inversed. And this is the entire point. The police system, the whole kind of thing has just been built up so much, and they've gained way too much power and influence in various cities to the point of running aground as they have now. There are alternative ways, as Nicole was saying, to handle things. Just to give that example, I read, and this is based on the statement of the owners of that store. They wrote, and maybe some of you saw it, they wrote a very sort of heartfelt letter, to folks saying, we feel so terrible about our involvement in this process. At least the owner did, and he was not there that day, is based on what the letter said. But they also said that by law, they were required to call the police when a counterfeit bill was used. By law, they were required to do that, and that led to this whole thing. So when calling the police becomes a possible death sentence, as it has so many times, society reaches a tipping point. I've had discussions with people, and they said they go into the individual cases. Well, the bill was counterfeit. Didn't he have a prior? And they're asking all these, and it's like you've completely misunderstood the situation. That knee on his neck is the same knee that's been on the necks of African American people and Latinx people and Native American people and various and Asian American people and other minority groups in this country for a very, very long time. It's that one thing too many, where the people will rise up. They pay the bills. They are Mr. Mayor, your boss. They are Mr. Governor, your boss. They are Mr. President, your boss as well, and the American people. And so all of that's gotten lost, you know, and that's where you have the kind of moment that's ripe for a revolution, which is exactly what we're basically have been living through now, an opportunity to completely rethink our societal imperatives, what we focus on. Schools we've heard the tales of teachers borrowing into their own pocket to pay for school supplies, and we all shake our heads and say, oh, that's not right. You know, we hear about all kinds of, you know, people scraping by that do critical mental health work. And I'm so glad that mental health was mentioned. That is such a key part of all of this. I'm interested in, you know, initiatives like Ricardo Neftali Arroyo, a new city councilor in the city of Boston, put forth an idea and a resolution that called racism a public health hazard. That's the kind of thinking that has been brought to the forefront by the activism and the you know, John Lewis says, get in good trouble. You know, the good trouble that people have been getting themselves in to create a society that values people, that values poor folks, that values that really is honest about the inequalities caused by capitalism, and not only honest about them, but actually has a heart behind it that cares enough to do something about some of these things. So when the people, you know, push back and rise up, it's time. Everyone all of a sudden says, "Oh my gosh, what can we do?" Well, here are the ideas. Here are people who've been researching them and thinking about them a lot longer than most of us. They've put in good research. I would encourage everyone to look at there's many platforms, but the Black Lives Matter platform is pretty clear, pretty solid on everything from reparations to police, and then we have to become more savvy about the difference between abolish the police versus defund the police, abolition versus reform, essentially, is where activists and some of the voices on this panel can help folks to understand what is happening right now in America. And also, you had a long time, you know, people were saying abolish ICE, you know, so there's things on the table that are critical. People have had it. Children in detention camps, no, thank you.
Thank you so much. So Nicole, I want to come back to you with the same question about the ballooning of the budgets. And then Helena, after that, I'm going to come to you because there's a question on the floor talking about the difference between transformative justice and restorative justice. And so I'll come to you next to get some examples of that. So Nicole, first, let me come to you, kind of to the same question that I laid out to Zebulon. What kind of the average person like me, what I'm trying to understand is looking at a budget in New York for policing, that if they said if New York was a country, it had the 33rd largest police budget on the planet. And so they're talking about putting out $100 million, peeling it off to help the community. And Los Angeles is talking about $150 million being peeled off. So I'm still feeling that it's still around the surface, because if you peel off $100 million on $1 billion budget, then really you're not making a peel at all. You're just trying to shut us up. You're trying to, get us off the streets and make it seem like you're doing something. So can you talk about the ballooning of these budgets and how we can attack that? Because that's really what we want, and not just simply having police take a knee with us or play basketball with us. It's the reform that we're looking at.
Sure. So first, let me tackle the question a little bit about why the budgets have grown, how police become, the only agency that gets funded in a recession, that gets their budget increased, why that kind of happens. And I'd say, the answer is twofold. One, it's largely very political. So, our elected officials are often thinking about crime in their city, in their state. And right now, the main apparatus that we have, or the main vision that people have about how to keep crime in control, is policing. And so you say, I want to make sure crime doesn't go up. I'm going to invest in our public safety, in our police. It's sort of just a clear, framework there. Another thing that I think we're increasing, that I'm actually starting to write about now, is about the role and the power of police unions in negotiations around the budget in how police are compensated, in how they are paid out for overtime. You know, a lot of people, I think, see the kind of equipment that police used in the protests across the country, and they say, how is it possible that we can't find PPE for our healthcare workers, but the police have tanks and tear gas and pepper spray, and they're just riot gear and very outfitted. And I think that there's sometimes a little bit of a confusion that a great deal of money that they have is being spent on those kinds of things. And that's actually only a small fraction of what police budgets really are made up of. The biggest line item in most cases is personnel. It's just boots on the ground. It's paying for officers' salary and pension and overtime, all of the benefits that go into it, right? That, you know, I'm starting to see more tweets and people unearthing just how much cops are compensated. And all of those decisions, or many of them at least, are the union gets to weigh in on. They get to set those rates. They get to sort of think about what makes sense as a compensation for police who they say are putting their lives on the line every day. So that's one component, or two components, right? The politics and the union side of it. I'd say another aspect of the ballooning budgets are about the way that policing has transformed over the years, and sort of gone back to a model of the past. So we've started to see cops really, and New York is a great example of this, embrace the notion of neighborhood policing, where if we can put cops in these neighborhoods, they get to know people, that, you know, they have a better interaction, they're building trust, they can potentially prevent and solve crime. You know, they have people who want to speak up when someone gets shot or, you know, when things get stolen. And neighborhood policing is expensive. It means that you need real personnel, real people to be in those communities. Has it actually amounted to much? The research is still out. The jury's still out there. Nevertheless, it's been heavily invested in. And so I spoke for the story I wrote about defunding with a couple police consultants. And one of the things they said specifically, again, in New York, was when Bloomberg came in, the police force was hovering around, you know, some 40 some odd thousand officers. And he said, this is too many. It's not sustainable. We got to kind of cut the force down. And he did over his terms. And when de Blasio came in, there was this push for neighborhood and community-oriented policing as another slogan. And the police force started to tick back up, right, in order to fulfill that mandate, that interest. It's something that I think we're seeing again with Joe Biden calling for more community-oriented policing. You know, I think he's put aside or setting aside $300 million to do that work, right? It's kind of the opposite of what the defund people are calling for. They're saying no more money, just invest in the community. So I think, you know, that's the sort of big why these budgets have gone up. And to the point around defunding, you know, what does it do to take $1 billion away from the NYPD over 5 years, or $150 million away? It's a really mixed bag, right? Again, the focus or the vision that a lot of these organizers have when they say defund, abolish the police through defunding them, is not just take money away. It's about giving money to other systems and other institutions, right? It's not simply one without the other. And so I think there is some cause for concern that if we're simply just stripping these agencies and not thinking about where that money goes, how it's supposed to transform or help people in need, find other ways of dealing with crime, that it might be all for nothing. And one of the things that we wrote about at the Marshall Project, as we questioned or, you know, took up this question of, like, can we defund the police? What would that look like? Is some of the unintended consequences that came out of the 2008 recession. You know, across the country, right, budget shortfalls, you know, really politicians had to find ways to shore up their budget from declining revenue in that recession. And police budgets started to get chipped away at. And what it meant was that more police were working overtime. You know, in Memphis is a great example. They actually started raising private dollars in order to create, to sustain some of the policing, which meant that it becomes much harder to investigate. You know, you don't know who that money is coming from. It often means that overtime goes up, so people actually wind up spending more money in the long term. So I think it's not just our headline was like, calls to abolish police are gaining ground. Here's why it's not a silver bullet, is that it's not simply just about taking that money away from the police, right? That there's other questions about how are they going to operate with a reduced budget in the first place? Does that mean that they're getting rid of people, that they're reallocating where people go and how that money's spent? But then what other alternatives are cities starting to invest in to prevent some of the violence? So that's, sort of much as I can give a 360 view on the task at hand.
Oh, that was excellent. Thank you so much. So we're going to come to you, Helena, and people are putting questions up into our chat. I want to say thank you so much. They're also sending me questions through the Q&A. So I am calling through them as quickly as possible. And I want to encourage you to keep sending them. If you've just joined us, we are here. We are representing ASALH, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. This is one of our first webinars. We really just started doing them to begin to address some of the issues that are happening within our community and using our community as a lens into these larger and broader issues. And so tonight, our conversation has really drilled down very deeply into what's happening with the police. Defund the police, abolish the police. What is the need for the police? Why are the police getting so much money? Why are we as citizens who are supposed to have the police to protect and serve, whatever that means, Nicole, why are we scared to call the police when there's an issue? And why is it when we do call the police, something like what happened to a Tatiana Jefferson, the Black woman who was shot and killed in her home when the cops showed up to do a wellness check, that they end up shooting and killing her with her nephew? That is why Black folks are afraid to call the police, because when they show up, they do it with guns blazing. So we need to kind of put this on the table. And I want to go to Helena to talk about transformative justice versus restorative justice. Like, both of those terms are on the table. Can you just kind of delineate between the two, and then also give us some examples? And then once you do that, Zebulon, I want to come to you. I know we only have a little bit of time left, is to begin the conversation around accountability and justice. What does that look like? And then we'll kind of begin to wrap up from there. Helena?
Thank you. Okay, so I know with restorative justice and transformative justice, there can be some confusion, and sometimes people do use it interchangeably, but restorative justice is all about a different way of justice that's not punitive, that aims to repair harm. So it involves the community, the victim, and the offender. And usually it's like a circle process or some form of addressing why did the harm occur, what needs to be repaired, what does the person who is the victim need. Now, the issue becomes a lot of organizations who themselves are harmful and violent have adopted and co-opted restorative justice. So now we see restorative justice practices in places like prisons and courts, right? And so now there's a tension, and the question becomes, does restorative justice truly depend on what was the relationship between the victim and the offender? Because what can you truly restore to if you are already working within an institution that is violent? Now, transformative justice is justice that aims to do the work without relying on the carceral state or even organizations. So it doesn't have to be just the police, not using the police. It can be even sometimes not using social workers, because sometimes social workers recreate policing in their actions, right? So it's rooted in an abolitionist framework. And the main part of transformative justice is that the state is violent in nature, and it thrives on its monopoly of violence. So transformative justice brings in the community, and it's really centered on communal accountability. So when harm occurs in a community, it's not just between the person who was harmed and the person who did the harm. It's also the people in the community that allowed the harm to occur. And so we also use harm instead of victim and offender, because we want to expand the way. Harm can be anything from something that the violent state does to something interpersonal within our lives, right? And so transformative justice, if we truly want to be transformed, is not just something that we do in our work in an organization, it's also the ways in which we embody transformative justice in our interpersonal relationships. And it also rejects the oppressive binary of victim and perpetrator, because life is a lot more nuanced. I think, Nicole, you alluded to this earlier, is that many times perpetrators have been victims themselves, but not all victims have been perpetrators, right? And so if we truly want to get to the root cause, we need to really get to that nuanced understanding of personhood. And so it centers, why did the harm occur, and what are some communal approaches of healing the harm. And so you ask not only what does the person who was harmed need, but what does the person who committed the harm need, so they don't commit the harm again to others and cause more harm. So it's really about interrupting those cycles of violence. And there's no expectation of forgiveness, because forgiveness is a personal journey, right? But it's really about the action. It's the idea that you are not a bad person, you're a perpetrator, you're bad. No, people are more nuanced. The action that you did was bad and harmful. How do we change that action, and what do you need for that to not occur, right? It's this idea of believing that people have the capacity to be transformed. So you're not just getting rid of police when you do transformative justice, you're getting rid of the action of policing and the oppressive binaries that come within that we have all been conditioned to believe in, and looking for alternatives to address the harm.
Yeah. I think that's spot on. It's just, there's so many inconsistencies and problems. Everyone knows there's need for reform, but here we have now, possibly for the first time, a real sort of chance to teach and to share some of those kinds of ways of thinking that may not have been part of our dialogue, or only in smaller circles. It's critical because, one thing that always strikes me, when you see these moments where a young Black man or young Black woman or Latinx or other groups are pulled over in their cars or confronted for things like just basically standing out in front of a building, right? Do you live here? The questioning begins. What are you doing here? What is your business here? And you watch these moments, and what I always notice is just the incompetence of this particular individual from the police that is now kind of like speaking for all police, because it gets magnified. But this individual, you can tell, if you're a good student of human behavior, you can feel that there's something's not right. It's more about the insecurity of the individual police officer, him or herself, right? And not. We've all seen people, when they don't feel like they're being respected or their authority is being respected, they get personally hurt about it. We can't have that. We cannot have our folks dying because you're having a bad day, or because you're insecure, or because something did for you. That's the problem. That total imbalance of power. At the same way that a white woman in Central Park at the drop of a Kleenex can weaponize Blackness and weaponize the police for their own personal use and need. That is a disparity that is so crazy that at your disposal, at your whim, someone's life can be gone. We have to deal with that massive systemic inequality that makes that possible. And we've always known, if you know the history of policing comes out of slavery. It comes out of, that sort of patrolling and of Black bodies and controlling of Black bodies and bordering and eventual post-slavery, slavery of a different kind, an eventual need of apparently to warehouse in massive amounts Black and brown bodies. You know, the United States incarcerates more people of any race than any other country in the world. We're one of the only countries to have private prisons. Companies whose mission it is, they have, I don't know, focus groups, meetings to talk about, you know, how many people do we have today, and then just umpteen different ways to make extra money on the side with collect phone calls and with you know, and then never mind, you know, farming out these folks to do work labor. I'm trying to say. Wow, what a you know, as so many times our eyes are sometimes off the ball in America. Just the abolition of slavery itself. You know, you look at the 13th Amendment, and right there in it is that clause, that exception clause, as some people call it now, that states that though, you know, those Nicole probably can break it all down better than I can, but or Helena. That says, you know, that slavery is only abolished in the event of, you know, whereupon someone has convicted a crime, unless they have convicted a crime. That's the exception. And so even there in our long march from slavery to freedom, right in the middle of that 1865, they slipped one by us. Right, that essentially that, you know, that we thought we were free, and yet, and so it all starts to make sense when you see that stock symbol on the Dow Jones for a private prison company. They made any new private prisons, is my understanding, in California are now abolished, and that's a step in the right direction. But and most of these detention centers are run by private firms whose bottom line is the warehousing and the incarceration of our people. Now, what does that sound like to you? That's slavery of another name, a new kind of slavery, a new way for America to reconfigure itself here in the beginning of the 21st century to basically give the illusion of some freedom, and yet these kind of tax, the militarization of the police. Do police need these kinds of coming in with essentially with tanks and body armor? They're making mistakes, more importantly. And that's the last thing I wanted to say. For such an important role in our society, you would think that we had much more screening for people who want to be police. I think it's easier to get a job at, you know, to be a policeman than it is McDonald's, because a lot of these people have records. They have a system of transferring and hiding. And is it any surprise? I can imagine, and this is the last thing I'm going to say, the unfair piece to a lot of these policemen, because I have a lot of police and people in criminal justice in my own family, and I have. It's not that we disrespect the police, but for many policemen, they're being put in harm's way and not equipped to handle the job that they themselves are being put into, because they've been told in the locker rooms, I would imagine, and behind the scenes, hey, you know, it's okay to rough them up. It's okay to be, oh, wait, I remember who said that. It was the president of the United States. So from the top, if you've been told that this is okay, and then you go out there thinking it's okay and acting as such, and now, so the police need to join Black Lives Matter and join our cause and come on over to reform and change this thing in a way that's going to work for all of us, including the police themselves.
So we have a number of questions on the table. Nicole, I want to come to you. There was a question on the table. Pia asked a question about parole and probation and how that's considered with regard to justice after prison. Can you unpack that a bit for us? And then, Helena, I'm going to come to you to talk a bit about healing justice, to see how all of this ties into what happens if prisons, as you noted earlier, Nicole, is not a place that does rehabilitation work. Then what are we really talking about setting up after that to get people, formerly incarcerated residents, reconnected back to their communities?
Sure. So I think that question was also in referring to Rayshard Brooks and some of the reporting. There was a video that was shared of him about his experience, I believe on probation or on parole. I don't quite remember which one, but first, a definition. So often low-level crimes get, instead of jail time, you get put on probation, right? So that's a period of time in which you are basically under state surveillance. You have a probation or a probation officer. You may have to check in. There's a laundry list of things that you have to do in order to stay compliant. And in that period of time, no new crimes or charges can be brought against you. You're always at risk of being incarcerated, of being sent to prison or to jail. And parole is for folks who have spent time in prison. They've been convicted of a felony, they've spent time, and they're being released, ahead of the end date of their final sentence on parole. They're also under state surveillance. They also have a parole officer who they also have to check in with, and they also have to follow, in many cases, a laundry list of rules in order to avoid being sent back to prison. And this is a real risk in people's lives. I wrote a story about Louisiana allowing more people on probation and parole to register to vote, to get their voting rights back. And in the process of reporting out that story, I found a man who'd been on parole in the state for 40 some odd years. So this, it meant that he had to check in with this officer and pay a fine for that entire time. He was in his, I believe, 50s, 60s at that point. And his parole officer sort of barely even came around anymore, out of an understanding that this man had put he turned his life around. The crime that he committed as a teenager was a mistake, that he felt remorse for it, that he spent time in prison for it. But this sentence was still looming over him. And so I think a lot of people have speculated that one of the reasons that Richard may have run away or may have been fearful of being arrested, being taken to jail, is that a violation like that, if for someone who's on probation or parole, potentially means real jail time, real prison time. And so there's just this constant risk that in some cases, for doing things like relapsing, if you are a drug offender, or if you're struggling with a drug addiction, drinking alcohol in some cases could, socializing with other people who have criminal records could land you back in prison. And so, that it's a big apparatus that millions and millions of people are currently under state surveillance in these forms. They're not currently incarcerated, but they're just one misstep away from landing in jail or in prison.
So Helena, I want to come to you and have you talk about healing justice and connecting all of this for us. And then we'll go back to Zebulon to kind of pull all this back under the title of Necropolitics. And then I'll give everyone a final statement and we'll begin to wrap it up. Helena?
Right. Thank you. So I think right now what we're seeing is that health is truly political. And when we say health, it's our social, political, financial, all of it. It's holistic. And so in the time of COVID, what we're seeing is who is dispensable for the sake of the economy. And I know we're talking about necropolitics, and I think Mbebe also states necroliberalism, right? So, from the COVID relief money that was given, a large chunk was given to law enforcement and the Bureau of Prisons. Ironically enough, those in prison are one of the most high-risk populations for COVID-19. So we're really pitting Black health versus the country thriving, but whose labor do we really feel entitled to as well, right? We have now discussing essential workers, and there's this narrative of them being heroic, but they're the same people that we're not willing to pay $15 an hour or living wages to, right? So I think it's really important when we discuss all of this that law, policies, bills are all value-laden, and they tell us what and who we value and who we care about. And so healing justice comes from a lineage of Black organizers that have been doing this work. I want to shout out the Black Panther Party and their community health clinics. They were really about deprofessionalizing and training lay people to take care of their own communal health. And so healing justice comes from specifically queer and trans people of color healers, especially Kara Page from the Southern Kindred Collective. And it's really about, Prentice Hemphill calls it resourcing from our hopes and desires more than our wounds. And we know that oppression is really the organization of trauma. Who gets what trauma, right? So Kara Page says, our movements themselves must be healing as a way of building sustainable change. We have to intervene and respond to generational trauma and violence in collective ways that address the way it shows up in our bodies, our hearts, and our minds. So the structure of healing justice or politicized healing is threefold. It's trauma healing from historic, cultural, structural trauma, individual trauma. It's centering communal health. 2, it's interrupting structures that harm us. And so fighting for access to jobs and food justice and housing. And 3, it's transformative justice. It's building new systems of care and accountability without the carceral state. And so healing justice really wants us to realize that health is political and it's all about resistance. We exist in large political systems that don't want us to be well and that most of the time profit from our lack of health. And it's also part of their political agenda to keep us unhealthy. So a part of our health and healing is reclaiming our power and knowing that we deserve to be healthy, not only as individuals, but communally. And I think this approach also centers, it's very anti-capitalist and anti-ableist in its being. And I'll give great examples of this. So it's ways of centering health and healing before, during, and after actions. So Black Lives Matter has a great healing justice toolkit where they talk about before direct actions, centering things such as grounding practices to do as a group. During, it's having visioning exercises for the future. It's having food, water, it's having communal support and resources. It's altar building. After actions, it's having spaces for reflection, processing, and resilience. Dignity and Power Now out of LA also does great healing justice work. And they talk about how they use healing justice first responders. So that looks like having listeners, people who are trained in psychological first aid or counseling at actions. It's having people that are trained in police de-escalation. It's having street medics at actions, which we've seen a lot with the protest around George Floyd. It's also having other healers, people that are trained in herbal medicine, that use sage, incense, and Dignity and Power Now also utilizes rotating wellness sessions. So that's incorporating health and healing. And it's also non-traditional healing, things like acupuncture or craniosacral. Those were 2 things that Chicago Torture Justice Center utilized a lot of. And so I think healing justice is a lot about collective care and responsibility and how we heal and we grow together as a community if we truly want to seek transformation.
Thank you so much, Helena. Dr. Milewski, I want to come to you. If you could just help us kind of pull all this together under the banner of Necropolitics, and then I'll get closing remarks from Nicole and from Helena. And I know Helena has prepared some resources that we will make sure get put with ASALH TV, but we want to make sure that people have the information that they need going forward. Dr. Milewski?
Yeah, sure. And thank you. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Kay, and just all of us, for who've been participating in this dialogue. It's been incredibly fruitful and I think very, very educational. Yeah, I mean, the reason why we're calling this Necropolitics is we wanted the word to go forth that we are not, lying down about this stuff as we watch what's happening in politics, as we watch what's happening, in our neighborhoods, as we watch what's happening in our dialogues and in the streets. We are not going to wait until after the fact to name some of the things that are happening in our country and in our world. So we're coming straight to the heart of the matter, necropolitics, where those in power decide essentially who lives and who dies in their actions or in their inactions, expressly around this. And so, and just to provide, I think it was a question that came in about where this comes from. Achille Mbembe, I hope I'm saying his name right, author of On the Post-Colony, was one of the first scholars to explore the term in depth. It comes out of sort of philosophical narratives and dialogues. And this is, so it's something that has been around for a long time. I mean, thinking about other pandemics, thinking about the AIDS crisis, thinking about, where there is one group who is more affected, and then that group, because of societal and historical reasons, has been seen as either less than or less than worthy. There was a time in the late 19th century where it was really believed that, much unlike, the sort of current, belief about African Americans in various areas, it was believed that African Americans were infirm, that they were sickly, that they were going to essentially die out. People put forward, and then policy sort of extended from that belief, right? Well, if these folks are not going to be here, and we're also doing things to make sure that, to ensure that they are not here, then we don't need to pay for schooling for them. We don't need to pay for public health. You don't need to fund. So there's your funding issues, around sort of social, ideas, many of which are incorrect. The destruction of the African American soul, spirit, mind, body has been in full out assault ever since the first enslaved person stepped foot in the Western Hemisphere, or became enslaved. Through this kind of thinking and way of knowing, we're naming what's happening and the connection to capitalism before it's too late. We're not going to wait until after to point out these connections, that we're giving a lie to the myth that there's no connection between slavery and capitalism itself. If you ask an economist, they'll tell you that slavery was pre-capitalist, right? It's just from some kind of other mercantilist, old world system. How could that possibly be, right? There's African bodies built right under Wall Street. Those bodies enabled the fueling of wealth, one of the greatest miracles of modern times in terms of becoming one of the richest countries in the shortest amount of time. And they provided the blood, sweat, and tears for which Wall Street is named, and the symbolism of Wall Street in terms of capitalism itself. The Black folks were the commodities. They were the commodities. That is to say, enslaved folks were the commodities in capitalism. You look at Confederate currency during the Civil War. There were slaves on the currency. And why not? Because that was the fueling of wealth. Has anyone ever wondered how America became the richest country in the shortest amount of time in the history of the modern world, or the world itself? They had massive shortcuts. And so that's part of the problem. There's no accounting for that sort of shorthand in the American capitalistic miracle. And so every once in a while, COVID being a big one, capitalism shows its flaws. It hasn't played fair with Black America, because when people have tried their best to fit into it and do what they had to do, they cheat. They redraw the lines. How about we come up with a code where everything that's under a red line on the map is going to be, value is going to go down. There's a great project on this in Minneapolis that our colleague Uhuru Williams has been a part of, because he's out in Minneapolis, speaking truth to power there. And so it comes down to it's just so much a part of that long march to freedom. And what people need to understand about Black America is that they have succeeded, they have excelled, they have survived despite America, right? This is a story of one of the most creative people, the most, able to get through things, able to make bricks out of straw, maybe able to find ways to survive, and in the process, come back and teach this country and help this country actually to reach its own stated goals. African Americans didn't come here saying we believed it, but no one was, saying all men are created equal and all this. That's America's stuff, right? That's America's stated belief that they never lived up to. The only time they ever came close to living up to it has been during Reconstruction and the Civil Rights Movement, which some people call the Second Reconstruction, and possibly right now. And that's why people like William Barber call this, and others, Manning Marable used to talk about it, the Third Reconstruction, a possibility of a fundamental rethinking of society, a reconstruction not only of things, but a reconstruction of society, and a society that cares more about the least of these, that does something to address this kind of poverty. And I think that people would do well to support the dreams and visions of the movement, Black Lives Matter, and the various other poor people's movement, and those who are mobilizing on the ground now, because, as Martin Luther King said, we're not wrong in what we're doing. If we're wrong, then the Constitution of the United States is wrong. If we're wrong, then the Declaration of Independence is wrong. If we're wrong, the Constitution is wrong. And if we're wrong, then God Almighty himself is wrong. And so we know we're not wrong in what we're doing, and we do so built on the framework of organizations like ASALH and Carter G. Woodson, and all of the knowledge that we have built up and that's been displayed in this discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Milewski. We definitely like to believe that we are not wrong here. We want to invite everyone who is not a member of a branch of ASALH to use this as an opportunity to reach out. As you look for where you're going to support, we want you to consider planting a seed into ASALH. The work that we're doing and picking up Carter G. Woodson's dream and going forward with that is only proof that Black organizations focused on teaching our history to the world, they matter. We have just about 2 minutes left. And so I just want to come to each participant and tell you 30 seconds, please, if you could just 30 seconds to a minute or so. But can you connect everything you've been talking about? Nicole, with your work around the Marshall Project and what's happening with the work in criminal justice. Helena, with your work in healing justice. And then Dr. Zeb, just very quickly with ASALH TV. Can you just give us very quickly, how can you persuade people that voting is the path to justice right now? Like, that will get us where we need to go. Nicole, I'll start with you.
Sure, I will try to keep it brief. I think right now with the move to defund, the question of defunding, right, the core question is, does policing work, right? Is it actually producing public safety? Are we safe because we have police? And people are asking us to really interrogate and investigate that question, and to notice they're drawing attention to an extraordinary disparity that exists in which police are funded at a high level, and all kinds of social services and programs for prevention of violence, simple things that provide for people's most basic needs are simply just not supported in most cities' budgets at the same way that policing is. And so it can be very hard to imagine that there is some sort of place out there beyond the one mechanism that we have right now. But activists and organizers are raising up this issue to say, what could our communities look like? What would our Black communities look like if we took this money away from police and actually gave it to institutions and to services and to programs that provided for people's needs, that recognized, the mental health needs, the economic needs, that really created well-resourced environments. And so that's, I think, at the core of this issue. Happy to be here with you guys. Great to represent the Marshall Project. We cover many dimensions of the criminal justice system. So if this has left you hungry for more, you have additional questions, please check us out, themarshallproject.org.
Thank you, Helena.
I think I want to leave off by saying that truly the personal is political. And so transforming our current situation is going to require all of us to have a personal transformation as well, in the ways in which we embody the values of these oppressive structures that we live in, and sometimes not the values that we hold dear. And a justice that heals requires that we center health and healing in our pursuit of justice, so that we don't recreate and continue cycles of violence and harm. And let us just reimagine communal safety. Imagination and creativity are truly liberatory. And Patrisse Cullors says, we live in a world in which other people imagined, like prisons, capitalism, all of these things came from someone else's imagination. So why can't we believe that we have the power to imagine something else, something different? And we can imagine ourselves into a new way of being. And I hope that everyone continues to center their own healing and health, continues to work on the ways that they can dismantle structures of violence, and also creates alternatives for themselves as well.
And so I'll end, and then I'll throw it to Dr. Zeb to wrap us up by just reminding you that in 1957, Dr. King gave one of his most powerful speeches where he talked about give us the ballot. And he went through just a list of all the things that Black folk could achieve, putting judges on the bench that could love us, and being able to not have to beg the government for the things we need in our community. But he said, give us the ballot. It was soon after that Malcolm X talked about the bullet or the ballot. And now in 2020, we don't have to be given the ballot, we have it. So my plea to people is to use the ballot. Put some skin in the game. Because if you want to transform this country, no matter how powerful your Twitter presence is or how wonderful you are on Facebook, you're actually going to have to get up and vote with your feet. Like, you have to be a part of the process. And that's one of the lanes that we should all get in if we're trying to radically transform this country. We don't have to be given the ballot. Exercise your right to use it. Dr. Zeb, I'll throw it to you to give us a very quick close as we wrap up our webinar.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all. This has been a wonderful discussion, and I want to thank all the attendees. We had 120 participants, seeing names that I recognize and respect on the list, and people asking questions, and branches are on, and we just thank you all so much. I have to just really, reflect on some of the things that have been thrown that we weren't able to necessarily answer tonight. But I think I couldn't agree more, Kay. I think, I know there's a lot of us who have wondered aloud. We've wondered in barbershops. We've wondered in conversations, what is the point of voting? I think that may have been somewhat of a valid point in the past, perhaps one worth considering. But I think now, when you see where we are, on the cusp of a realization of something different and something new that's going to be valuable for all citizens, that's going to make America a place that values all of it, then it's really time, again, like it was in the past when Obama was running, like it was in other times, because numbers have gone down, to vote. Remember George Floyd's brother's words right there, footsteps from where his brother was killed. He turned to the audience and he said, "You all need to vote." I couldn't believe it. That's absolutely right. It's not, not everyone has time to be in the streets. Vote and exercise the franchise. And last thing, I just want to also invite everyone to vote in a different way, which is to subscribe to ASALH TV on our YouTube channel. Visit us on our Facebook page, the ASALH Facebook page, and there's also the ASALH Conference Facebook page. And we are planning, last thing, another webinar coming up on July 2nd at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And the title of that webinar is taken from the Black History Bulletin that just came out this recently. Black Lives Matter, from enslavement to engagement. So we're going to continue this discussion, certainly, and we hope to welcome back also some of our panelists today, and thank you all for making the time and joining us this evening. We hope to see you on the next broadcast of ASALH TV. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.